Charlie Chaplin wasn't just a filmmaker, he was a target of the FBI for 50 years, monitored by J. Edgar Hoover's agents who compiled over 2,000 pages documenting his politics, relationships, and private conversations in an effort to prove he was a communist threat to America. The surveillance began in 1922 when Chaplin's films started showing sympathy for the poor and unemployed, and intensified through the 1940s as Hoover became obsessed with destroying the comedian who'd never become an American citizen despite living in the U.S. for 40 years, leading to the moment in September 1952 when Chaplin sailed to England for a film premiere, and the U.S. government revoked his re-entry permit while he was mid-ocean, forcing him into 20 years of exile. This video reveals what the 2,000-page declassified FBI file actually contains versus what Hoover claimed it proved, how the government used Chaplin's relationships with younger women and his refusal to take loyalty oaths as pretext for deportation when the real goal was silencing his political voice, why Chaplin chose permanent exile over returning to face Immigration Service interrogation about his beliefs, what happened when Chaplin finally returned to America in 1972 at age 83 to receive an honorary Oscar after 2 decades away, and how FBI surveillance continued until 1978, even after his death, monitoring his family and associates as if the threat of a silent film comedian's politics could still destabilize the nation. The file folder landed on J. Edgar Hoover's desk with a thud. FBI Headquarters, Washington, D.C. March 9. Subject: Charles Spencer Chaplin. Status: British national residing in United States. Preliminary surveillance authorized. Hoover opened the folder. 3 pages. Sparse information. Charlie Chaplin, age 32. Silent film star. Enormous wealth. Lives in Beverly Hills. Never applied for U.S. citizenship despite living in America since 19. The report noted recent concerns. Chaplin's latest film, The Kid, showed sympathetic portrayal of poverty. His public statements criticized wealth inequality. He'd attended a gathering where socialist literature was distributed. None of this was illegal. Chaplin had broken no laws, made no threats, engaged in no conspiracy. But Hoover circled a phrase in the report. Subject expresses sympathy for communist ideology. He wrote in the margin, maintain surveillance, expand investigation, find evidence of un-American activities. This was the beginning. March 1922, a 3-page file on a comedian who made people laugh. By 1952, that file would contain over 2,000 pages. By 1978, it would document 56 years of continuous monitoring, and it would accomplish what Hoover intended from the start: destroy Charlie Chaplin's American life. The agent closed the folder after adding his latest surveillance report. Los Angeles Field Office, September 9. Subject departed Los Angeles by train September 17, 1952, en route to New York. Boarded RMS Queen Elizabeth, September 18. Destination, London, England. Purpose, film premiere of Limelight. Expected return, late October. What the agent didn't write, because he didn't know yet, was that Charlie Chaplin would never return. The order had already been sent. While Chaplin was sailing across the Atlantic, Attorney General James McGranary signed the document revoking his re-entry permit. When Chaplin's ship reached mid-ocean, a telegram arrived. U.S. government message. Official. Final. Re-entry permit revoked. Subject: Charles Chaplin barred from returning to United States pending Immigration Service hearing regarding communist affiliations and moral character. Chaplin read the telegram in his cabin. Understood immediately. After 40 years in America, the government had waited until he was physically outside the country to lock the door behind him. He could contest it, return to face immigration hearings, answer questions about his politics, his beliefs, his associations, his morals, or he could stay away, live in exile, never see America again. The FBI file had won. Hoover had won. Chaplin's American life was over. And the comedian who'd made the world laugh stood in a ship cabin holding a telegram, understanding that everything he'd built in America for 4 decades had just been taken away by a government that feared his movies showed too much sympathy for the poor. Charlie Chaplin arrived in America in 1910, age 21, British citizen, part of a vaudeville troupe touring music halls. He was nobody. Another performer in a crowded entertainment industry. No fame, no wealth, no reason for anyone to pay attention. By 1914, everything had changed. Chaplin had been discovered by film studios. His tramp character, the little man in a bowler hat with a cane and mustache, became an international phenomenon. By 1920, Chaplin was the most famous entertainer in the world, founded his own studio, made films that earned millions, lived in a mansion in Beverly Hills, hobnobbed with royalty and presidents. He was also still a British citizen. never applied for American citizenship despite a decade in the country. This wasn't unusual. Many immigrants maintained their original citizenship. But for the FBI, it became a problem. Why wouldn't someone so successful, so embedded in American culture, become an American citizen? Hoover suspected the answer. Because Chaplin's loyalties lay elsewhere. Because he was fundamentally foreign. Because he couldn't take loyalty oaths he didn't believe. The surveillance that began in 1922 was initially passive. FBI agents attended Chaplin's parties, noted who he associated with, recorded conversations when possible, documented his public statements. The file grew slowly. Reports came in from Los Angeles field office monthly. Most contained nothing actionable. Chaplin attended Hollywood events, made films, lived ostentatiously, but certain details were flagged. 1923. Chaplin attended a gathering where socialist writer Upton Sinclair spoke about labor rights. Chaplin contributed money to striking workers. 1925. Chaplin made public statements criticizing wealth inequality in America. Said the rich were getting richer while the poor starve. 1927. Chaplin's divorce from Lita Gray became public scandal. The 42-page divorce complaint contained allegations about his private life that embarrassed him but also provided FBI with ammunition about his moral character. 1931. Chaplin visited Soviet Union, met with Soviet officials, said positive things about Soviet cinema, returned to America and described the trip as fascinating. Each item was added to the file. Each was labeled as evidence of communist sympathies or moral turpitude. By 1935, the FBI file on Charlie Chaplin exceeded 200 pages. None documented any crime. None proved any conspiracy. But the file existed, and it justified continued surveillance. What exactly was the FBI looking for? What would constitute proof that Charlie Chaplin was a threat to America? Hoover's definition was broad and vague. Evidence of communist activities, associations with known communists, statements promoting communist ideology, or behavior that demonstrated un-American values. In practice, this meant everything Chaplin did could be interpreted as suspicious. When Chaplin made films showing poor people sympathetically, evidence of communist propaganda promoting class warfare. When Chaplin criticized American capitalism, evidence of un-American ideology. When Chaplin associated with intellectuals who had leftist views, evidence of communist conspiracies. When Chaplin refused to become a U.S. citizen, evidence that he rejected American values. When Chaplin had relationships with younger women, evidence of moral degeneracy that proved he lacked the character to be trusted. The FBI file documented all of it, built a narrative that Chaplin was simultaneously a communist agent and a moral degenerate, two accusations that contradicted each other but served the same purpose, justifying his removal from America. By the 1940s, the surveillance had intensified. World War II heightened concerns about foreign nationals. The post-war Red Scare made anyone with leftist sympathies a target. Chaplin made a critical mistake in 1940. He released The Great Dictator. The film was a satire of Adolf Hitler and fascism. Chaplin played dual roles, a Jewish barber and a dictator, clearly based on Hitler. The film ended with a 6-minute speech calling for peace, democracy, and human decency. The speech was passionate, idealistic, called for people to reject tyranny and embrace brotherhood. To many, it was inspiring. To the FBI, it was evidence. The speech criticized nationalism, criticized militarism, called for international cooperation, used language that echoed communist rhetoric about workers uniting across borders. Hoover added the speech to the file as evidence that Chaplin was promoting communist ideology through his films. The fact that the film was anti-Hitler and pro-democracy didn't matter. What mattered was that Chaplin was using his platform to promote political messages the FBI deemed suspicious. Then came the Joan Barry case. Joan Barry, a 22-year-old woman, accused Chaplin of fathering her child. Paternity suit. Scandal. Media frenzy. Blood tests proved Chaplin wasn't the father. Scientifically impossible given their blood types. But California courts at the time didn't accept blood tests as definitive evidence. The jury convicted Chaplin of paternity anyway. He was ordered to pay child support. The case destroyed Chaplin's reputation. Media portrayed him as a predator, an immoral older man exploiting young women. The FBI seized the opportunity. Hoover directed agents to compile every detail of Chaplin's relationships with women, every affair, every rumor, every piece of gossip. The file expanded with sections labeled moral character evidence. Hoover planned to use these not to prove Chaplin was a communist. There was still no evidence of that, but to prove he was morally unfit to remain in America. The strategy: if we can't deport him for communism, we'll deport him for immorality. In 1948, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, began calling witnesses to testify about communist infiltration in Hollywood. Directors, writers, actors, anyone suspected of leftist sympathies was subpoenaed, asked to name names, asked to denounce communism, asked to prove their loyalty to America. Charlie Chaplin was never subpoenaed. HUAC knew he'd refuse to cooperate, knew he'd turn the hearing into a spectacle that would embarrass them, but they sent a message through intermediaries. Cooperate voluntarily, denounce communism publicly, become an American citizen, and take loyalty oaths. Prove you're not a threat. Chaplin refused, not because he was a communist, he wasn't, but because he rejected the premise that the government could demand proof of loyalty from artists. "I am an artist, not a politician," he said in a statement. "My work speaks for itself. I will not be bullied into making declarations to satisfy paranoid bureaucrats." The refusal sealed his fate. If Chaplin wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't prove his loyalty, then the assumption was he had something to hide. Hoover intensified the surveillance. FBI agents followed Chaplin everywhere, monitored his phone calls, opened his mail, attended his film sets disguised as crew members. The file documented his movements, conversations, associations. Agents noted when he had lunch with suspected communists, when he donated money to leftist causes, when he made statements criticizing American foreign policy. By 1950, the file exceeded 1,500 pages. Still no evidence of espionage, no proof of Communist Party membership, no documentation of illegal activities. But Hoover didn't need proof of crimes. He needed justification for deportation. And the file, massive, detailed, damning in its accumulation of suspicious but legal behavior, provided that justification. The plan was simple: wait for Chaplin to leave the country, then revoke his re-entry permit, force him to choose between exile and returning to face immigration hearings, where the FBI file would be used to prove he was an undesirable alien. Chaplin rarely traveled internationally. But in 1952, he announced plans to attend the London premiere of his new film, Limelight. He'd be gone 6 weeks, sailing to England in September. Hoover saw his opportunity. The moment Chaplin's ship left American waters, the trap would close. September 17, 1952. Charlie Chaplin left Los Angeles by train. FBI agents followed him to New York, documented his arrival at the pier, watched as he boarded the RMS Queen Elizabeth with his wife Una and their 4 children. The ship departed September 18, 5 days crossing the Atlantic. Chaplin relaxed for the first time in years, away from FBI surveillance, away from constant press scrutiny, away from the paranoia of McCarthy-era America. On September 19, one day after Chaplin's ship departed, Attorney General James McGranary held a press conference. The Department of Justice has revoked the re-entry permit of Charles Spencer Chaplin, pending a hearing to determine whether he should be permanently excluded from the United States. Reporters asked why. McGranary cited the FBI file, evidence of communist sympathies, associations with known subversives, and moral turpitude, including violations of the Mann Act. The Mann Act accusation was new, a law prohibiting transporting women across state lines for immoral purposes. The FBI had no evidence Chaplin violated it, but the accusation added criminal overtones to what was essentially a political deportation. The telegram reached Chaplin's ship on September 20, mid-ocean, halfway to England. No way to turn back even if he wanted to. Re-entry permit revoked. Return to United States will require immigration service hearing. Failure to appear will result in permanent exclusion. Chaplin understood immediately. This wasn't about proving his innocence. This was about humiliation. They wanted him to return, submit to interrogation, answer questions about his beliefs and associations, beg for permission to re-enter the country where he'd lived for 40 years. He showed the telegram to Una. "I won't give them the satisfaction. I won't return to face their inquisition. But your studio, your home, everything you've built, it's already gone." The moment they sent this telegram, they took it all. Chaplin made the decision that night. He would stay in Europe, would not return to America, would not submit to immigration hearings, would live in exile rather than participate in the spectacle Hoover had orchestrated. The ship arrived in Southampton on September 20. Press swarmed. Questions shouted about the revoked permit. Chaplin gave a brief statement. "I have been the object of lies and propaganda by powerful reactionary groups who, by their influence and by the aid of America's yellow press, have created an unhealthy atmosphere in which liberal-minded individuals can be singled out and persecuted. Will you return to face the immigration hearing?" "No. I will not return to a country that treats its artists like criminals for having opinions." The statement made headlines. Chaplin choosing exile over submission. The comedian who'd made America laugh for 40 years, now declaring he'd rather live anywhere else than face government interrogation about his politics. When portions of the FBI file were declassified in 2002, 50 years after Chaplin's exile, researchers finally saw what 2,000-plus pages of surveillance had actually documented. The revelations were stunning, not because of what the file proved, but because of what it didn't. Section 1. Communist Association. The FBI had documented every time Chaplin attended a gathering where anyone with leftist views was present. Listed names of suspected communists he'd been photographed near. Transcribed conversations where Chaplin expressed sympathy for workers or criticized capitalism. But nowhere in 800 pages was evidence that Chaplin was a Communist Party member. No evidence he'd engaged in espionage. No evidence he'd conspired with Soviet agents. No evidence he'd done anything illegal. The evidence consisted of attending parties with leftists, donating to labor unions, making films that showed poor people sympathetically, criticizing American wealth inequality. None of this was illegal. All of it was protected speech under the First Amendment. But the FBI treated it as proof of subversive intent. Section 2. Moral Character. This section documented Chaplin's relationships with women, marriages, affairs, paternity suits, divorce scandals. The FBI had compiled gossip, rumors, and tabloid reports, detailed descriptions of Chaplin's private life that had no relevance to national security. The Joan Barry case filled 200 pages, despite blood tests proving Chaplin wasn't the father. The file treated the court's erroneous paternity ruling as fact, ignoring the scientific evidence. The Lita Gray divorce filled another 150 pages, focusing on the scandalous 42-page complaint that had detailed Chaplin's private behavior during their marriage. The rest documented various relationships, rumors of affairs, and gossip from Hollywood social circles. Again, nothing illegal, just invasive documentation of a public figure's private life, compiled to support claims of moral turpitude that could justify deportation. Section 3. Surveillance Logs. Daily reports from FBI agents. What time Chaplin left his house, where he went, who he met, what he said at parties, what mail he received. For decades, the FBI had devoted resources to monitoring a filmmaker who made comedies. Agents sat outside his house, tapped his phones, opened his mail, followed him to restaurants and parties. The logs were mundane. Subject attended dinner at Chasen's restaurant. Companions, Douglas Fairbanks, Mary Pickford. Conversation topics, film industry, recent productions. No political discussion observed. Page after page of nothing. Just documentation that Chaplin lived a normal, wealthy Hollywood life. But the surveillance continued year after year, building a file that suggested constant watching must mean there was something to find. Section 4. Political Statements. This section compiled everything Chaplin had ever said publicly about politics. Quotes from interviews, speeches, film dialogue that the FBI interpreted as political. The 6-minute speech from the great dictator filled 20 pages, transcribed, analyzed, annotated with FBI commentary claiming it promoted communist ideology. Quotes about wealth inequality, statements criticizing militarism, comments about international cooperation, all labeled as un-American. But reading the actual quotes, devoid of FBI interpretation, revealed nothing sinister. Chaplin had expressed standard liberal views about social justice, peace, and human rights, views shared by millions of Americans, views protected by the Constitution. The FBI had taken normal political speech and reframed it as subversive propaganda. The conclusion: no evidence. After 50-plus years of surveillance, after 2,000-plus pages of documentation, after spending hundreds of thousands of dollars monitoring Charlie Chaplin, the FBI file concluded: no evidence of Communist Party membership, no evidence of espionage activities, no evidence of conspiracy against the United States. Subject's political views are liberal and critical of American capitalism, but do not constitute illegal activity. In other words, Chaplin wasn't a threat. Never had been. The entire surveillance operation had found nothing. But Hoover had gotten what he wanted anyway. Chaplin was gone, exiled, removed from American public life. The file had served its purpose not to prove Chaplin was dangerous, but to create justification for destroying him. Chaplin settled in Switzerland, bought a mansion in Vevey, beautiful views of Lake Geneva, far from America, far from FBI surveillance. He continued making films. A King in New York, 1957. McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Chaplin's response to the persecution he'd faced. A Countess from Hong Kong, 1967. But the exile took its toll. Chaplin had lived in America for 40 years, built his career there, made his fortune there, All his friends, his studio, his home, everything was in California. Now he was 63 years old, starting over in Europe, blacklisted in America. His films couldn't be shown in American theaters. His back catalog was effectively banned. A generation of Americans grew up never seeing Charlie Chaplin films because the government had labeled him un-American. Una, his wife, could return to America. She was born in the U.S., daughter of playwright Eugene O'Neill. But Chaplin couldn't. So Una stayed in Switzerland with him. Their children grew up in exile, American citizens by birth but raised in Europe because their father had been banned from the country of his career and fortune. Occasionally, Chaplin gave interviews. Reporters asked if he regretted his refusal to return for the immigration hearing. No. I would rather live in exile than submit to their inquisition. I made people laugh for 40 years. That was my crime, being too successful, too independent, too willing to show poor people as human beings deserving of dignity. Do you miss America? I miss what America represented before fear and paranoia infected it. The America that welcomed artists and celebrated creativity. That America is gone. What remains is a country terrified of its own citizens having opinions. The FBI surveillance continued even in exile. Agents monitored Chaplin's activities in Switzerland, noted his visitors, tracked his correspondence. The file continued growing despite Chaplin being physically outside the country. Why? Because Hoover still feared Chaplin's influence. His films could still be shown in Europe. His statements could still be quoted in American media. As long as Chaplin was alive, he was a potential threat to the narrative that the government's persecution had been justified. The FBI file on Charlie Chaplin didn't close until 1978, a year after Chaplin died. 56 years of continuous surveillance. All to monitor a comedian who made silent films about a little tramp who made people laugh. 20 years after exile, Charlie Chaplin received a letter from the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, an invitation. The Academy wanted to give him an honorary Oscar, recognition for his contributions to cinema, a tribute to his career. But there was a problem. The ceremony was in Los Angeles. Chaplin would have to return to America, the country that had exiled him 2 decades earlier. Chaplin was 82 years old, frail, his health declining. This would be his only chance to return, to see America one more time before he died. The U.S. government issued a special visa, temporary, for the awards ceremony only. Not a restoration of his right to live in America, just permission to visit for a few days. Chaplin accepted. On April 10, 1972, he flew to Los Angeles with Una. The Oscar ceremony was emotional. Chaplin walked slowly to the stage. The audience stood, everyone. Directors, actors, industry veterans who'd worked with him. A 12-minute standing ovation. Chaplin stood at the microphone, tears in his eyes, unable to speak for a moment, overwhelmed by the reception. Finally, thank you for this honor. Words seem so futile, so feeble. I can only say thank you for the honor of inviting me here, and you're wonderful, sweet people. Thank you. Brief words, but the emotion was clear. This was closure, recognition after 20 years of exile, vindication after decades of persecution. The Academy screened clips from his films. The Kid, City Lights, Modern Times, The Great Dictator. Audiences laughed, remembered why Chaplin had been beloved. And in that moment, the absurdity of his exile was undeniable. This man who'd brought joy to millions, who'd created art that transcended language and culture, had been banned from America for 20 years because the FBI feared his politics. After the ceremony, Chaplin spent 3 days in Los Angeles, visited old friends, saw his former studio, drove past his Beverly Hills mansion, now owned by someone else but still there, a ghost of his American life. Then he returned to Switzerland. The visa was temporary. He couldn't stay. America had welcomed him for 3 days to give him an award, but his exile remained in effect. Chaplin died on Christmas Day, 1977, age 88, at his home in Vevey, Switzerland. He never lived in America again. The 3-day visit in 1972 was his last time on American soil. The FBI file remained classified, wouldn't be released for another 25 years. The truth about the surveillance, the baseless accusations, the political persecution, all of it hidden until long after Chaplin was gone. FBI Archives, Washington, D.C. Present day, in a secure storage facility, filed under Chaplin, Charles Spencer, sits the file that destroyed him. 2,062 pages. Surveillance reports spanning 1922 to 19... The file is public now, declassified in 2002. Anyone can request copies. See what the FBI compiled. Read what J. Edgar Hoover considered evidence of un-American activities. March 1922. First entry, subject requires monitoring. September 1952, entry, subject departed United States, re-entry permit revoked. Case status, successful removal. December 1977, final entry, subject deceased. File remains active pending assessment of ongoing influence. Anas 6 tomes, over 2,000 pages. Conclusion, no evidence of illegal activity, but the file accomplished its purpose. Not to prove Chaplin was dangerous, to destroy him anyway. Charlie Chaplin made films about a little tramp who defied authority and defended the downtrodden. The FBI spent half a century proving that in America, such defiance would not be tolerated, even if you made people laugh, even if you broke no laws, even if you were the most beloved comedian in the world. The file sits in archives now, public record, evidence of persecution disguised as investigation. Chaplin never returned to live in America, died in exile, buried in Switzerland, but his films remain. The tramp still makes people laugh, still shows dignity in poverty, still defies authority with grace. The FBI couldn't destroy that, despite 56 years of trying. The file is thick, but the films are immortal, and history remembers who deserved exile. It wasn't Charlie Chaplin.